Here are some images that are typical of what I would look at as reference photos. So to start, that little X there in the middle of the painting is to keep my camera's focused, because when it's just a white board, the camera is having a hard time knowing what to focus on. So it kind of goes in and out a little bit. You'll notice that I just put a whole bunch of white paint on my palette. And that's because I wanted to do an experiment. I saw in my mind all of this thick red and yellow and orange foliage all through this fall scene. And I wondered if there might be a more fun and engaging way of getting thick, juicy color and leaf structure in my painting, rather than just building up in those thinner layers the way I would normally go about it. So often I'll start with a wash of color, and then I'll come in and little by little over time, I'll start to build up thicker and thicker paint as I go. This way I thought, well, if I start right off with a bunch of thick paint and just pile it on there, thick white paint, then I can come back in and the branches, the leaves, everything can kind of intermix, and I can get a lot of that really nice soft blending of edges. And so like with the branches, I felt that it would help me to get those in there in a way that I could easily have softer edges, especially for the branches that I wanted to, the really small, thin branches that I wanted to have fill as if they were back in to the foliage, not right there in front of the, right there near the viewer, basically. You'll notice here too that that paint is wet. The little bit that I put on my panel is of that crimson color is still wet. So it's getting into the white. But I'm not worried about that because it really fits in with the colors I'm going to have in my foliage anyway. So once I had applied all of that with the palette knife, or actually it wasn't a palette knife, it was a big spackling knife, I decided to come in with just a big old, it's just a hardware brush. I think it's 1 or 2 inches, probably 2-inch hardware brush, just to get in there with some brush texture. The size of the brush doesn't matter, the type of brush. It's really just having a brush that has, the bristles are stiff enough that I can go back into all of that thick paint and get those bristles to stand out, because I want it to look like it was put on with brushes. I'm not a palette knife artist. There's a lot of beauty that can come from the palette knife, and I do use a palette knife periodically in my paintings, but for the most part, I am fascinated with the texture that comes from brush bristles, and that's what I want to have in that white paint as well. So once I've got that established, you notice I didn't bring it all the way down the panel, and that way I can come on with the lower foliage. It is going to be full of a lot of fallen leaves and other remnants of fall activity, but I don't necessarily want to have that all thick like I do the upper part, because the upper part is really going to be the focus of the painting, all of that upper foliage in the trees that's still alive. But I want the bottom area to have a lot of activity, as if a lot of those leaves have fallen and are building up on the forest floor. So I know there's going to be a lot of oranges and yellows and reds and all these other colors that I want to have in there. So starting with a nice warm reddish brown using the transparent oxide red, I can achieve that. I can get an undercolor wash to lay the foundation, the beginning work to all of that that's going to be applied in there. And that gives a harmonious undertone to everything that I'll be applying here later with my colors. So now I want to come in and start to work on the middle ground. of this painting. I want this to feel like it's kind of a misty day, and there's a lot of atmosphere involved in it. It's basically more, not so much of a sunny day, even though there's a lot of sunshine light filtering through. It's more of an overcast day that's a bright overcast day. So I want that to fill with all of that atmosphere, with all the moisture that's in the air. I want the color to really play off of that, to make it feel as if there's a lot of atmosphere. And so a lot of lavenders in that, down in under the canopy of tree foliage and branches and everything else that's going on in this nice thick woodsy area of shade trees. It's going to, all those lavenders, especially more on the bluish and reddish side of those lavenders. Well, bluish a little bit, but more on the reddish side, because I want them to really harmonize with the leaves. They're going to be so full of warm colors. So I don't want it to be too much of a stark contrast. I do like to have a mix of colors when it comes to warm and cool. And the lavender is definitely going to be on the cooler side, but if I have it too blue, then that blue is going to, because it's going to be such a strong contrast from all the warms in there, it will sometimes have a tendency to actually pop forward. I know we've heard all the time, warm colors advance, cool colors recede. That is a generalization, and it doesn't apply in every situation. In fact, there are a lot of situations that it doesn't apply in. So I'm aware of that, and I want to make sure that as I'm building this, I keep that in mind, that if it's too brightly blue of a lavender, it will have a tendency, because of the sharp change in color temperature between all of the other temperatures that are going to be in there, because down below, even in the fallen foliage, there's going to be a lot of warm colors in there with all of the leaves. So because there's going to be warm on the top, warm on the bottom, in the middle, if I get it too cool, if I have too much blue in that lavender, that's going to pop out, because it's going to be the contrasting temperature. It's going to be the thing that's different, kind of like in Sesame Street. One of these things is not like the other. The one thing that's not like the other tends to stand out way too much. So that same thing, that same phenomenon, I saw that when I was painting on location, the White River Landing. There were some shadows off in the distance, and I knew they were going to be cooler just from where they were placed on the backsides of trees away from the light source. But when I made them too blue, they just popped right out of there, even though they were very small and a long ways away, comparatively speaking, to the river that was near the viewer. These were quite a ways down the river, and they were very small in comparison with the rest of the painting. But because I made the blue a very bright, obvious blue, they just popped right forward and came right at the viewer. So I had to then gray those down, take away a lot of that blue luminous quality to it, and help to push those back into the shadows again. So that's part of what I'm thinking about with all of these colors that I'm putting in now, is to have them harmonize with all of that leaf structure and not just pop out and come forward to the viewer, because I want that area to actually move back in there, and move back in a way that's still going to be inviting. Not a real dark and gloomy, like my son likes to watch this show, and they talk about, it's Dino Trucks, and they talk about the dark forest. Well, I don't want this to feel like the dark forest that people are going to be afraid to go into. Mystery's nice, but this is more of one of those days where it's just misty, and somebody could go out with a little, maybe a rain slicker and some boots, and enjoy just walking through the woods. That's my concept, what I have in my mind for this. So you can see I'm thinking here about composition as far as the shapes go. I'm not worried about particular objects at this moment. I'm thinking of overall shapes. So the upper area there with the sky portion that doesn't have any leaf structure in it yet, no lavenders, no other colors. The area with the lavender, all of those, each of those is a shape right now. So the white area is a little triangle shape. That middle lavender is kind of an odd, not quite square with it's a diagonal rectangle basically with the ends kind of cut off. And then down on the bottom we have that triangle of warm red-brown in there. That's why I'm moving the lavender down some so that I can break up the types of shapes that are in there. Make sure that I have very much a hierarchy of shapes. All the lavenders, they're going to be the foundation for all of the leaf structure that'll go in there, and that's the primary focus. So I want that to be the largest shape in my painting. And then the area down below with all of the fallen foliage, I want that to be my secondary shape, the one that's the second in size. And then up above, that small triangle of sky. I don't want the triangle of sky to demand too much attention. I'll be placing plenty of little branches and foliage over that, but I do want it to feel bright up there, as if we're kind of getting up. The canopy isn't so thick that we can't see the sky. That's the idea there. And I'll play with that. So working with all of this thick paint when it's nice and wet is wonderful because it's so great for soft edges. I can really play with all of that and have everything feel like it is misty, and there's almost a little bit of it's almost like there's fog there that obscures the shapes of things. We can kind of see the shape. We might be driving down the road and we see something that looks like it might be a tree, but it's a little obscured. It's the same idea, just not to the extent that we have trouble really identifying what it is. We can see clearly what each of the things are in this painting, but the edges become obscured a bit. They become softer and more broken. And that's really that idea of that much thick paint, and the way that thick paint will help those edges it'll help to break up those edges as I carve down through some of that paint. Because it won't be just a smooth, crisp line that might happen if I was painting with a little detail brush and going on my panel without any paint there. I can get a nice, really sharp line with a brush, and all the edges are crisp and sharp. Well, in this case, when I have that kind of thick paint, it's like, I don't know if you've ever done anything with clay or working in a kitchen with dough. If you try to cut through something that is a little bit soft and thick like that, you'll notice that it doesn't necessarily just cut razor sharp. It has all these little rough edges to it. That's the effect. And those little rough edges of paint that didn't quite move out of the way, those are the little rough edges that break up things and break up branches, break up leaves, and help things to really feel atmospheric. So with what I'm doing now, this is very helpful to now come in with tree trunks and other shapes. Maybe it's a bush off in the distance, or a big rock, or a ledge, or something like that. I can create the semblance of objects as far as tree branches, tree trunks, rocks, and bushes without those being entirely identifiable. And so I want them to be light and kind of blend in. All that white paint is helping me to keep the values on the brighter side, higher key, often in the middle of this painting. And that helps then to create the feeling that all of those branches and trees and other objects, whatever they might be, are a ways away from us. They're off in the distance and they're being obscured. So I just go in, and it's just a time of experimenting. I'm just playing with shapes. So remember, when we talk about shapes, I try to think about shapes primarily for a long time through the painting. Rather than thinking about objects, I'm thinking about shapes. And so we had our three beginning shapes, the two triangles, and then the kind of rectangle in the middle there. Well, within each of those shapes, we are also going to have subordinate shapes, lots of smaller shapes to break up those big shapes, but not so that it takes away the overall shape of the shape to begin with, if that makes sense. I'm not taking away the rectangle shape. I'm not taking away the triangles. You'll still feel that there's a triangle there, there's a rectangle there, but within that, we have plenty of smaller and medium-sized shapes to break up that overall dimension. And that way it'll help those smaller shapes that are breaking that up all through it will help to tie all those three shapes, the three beginning shapes, it'll help tie those together. So that everything feels like it's actually in the same location. The trees, the foreground, everything feels like they belong with one another. That's the purpose to that. So with an image like this, especially when I'm working a lot from my imagination, I play with so many different possibilities. Really, in a painting like this, the possibilities are endless. We could go so many different directions. And on one hand, I love that. I know that I can do whatever I want and it's going to be all right because I'm making it up as I go. Now, I am using a lot of what I've learned when I go out on location to help guide me in that process, but I really can use my imagination and have fun with it. At the same time, that can be pretty scary when we don't know necessarily exactly where we're going to go with it. Do I really know what I'm doing here? Can I pull this off? Can I make it feel like this is an actual place and it has merit to it? Somebody's going to look at it and think, yeah, I think I've been there before. I recognize that location, even though it might come out of entirely our imagination. So a lot of what I do now is playing with that. And right here, I'm not a real fan of just white very often, even in clouds. I like to have some kind of color involved in it. So I'm taking all that white paint and adding what I consider to be a nice bright color to it, with just a little bit of that cadmium yellow medium, a little bit of manganese blue into it, maybe some phthalo blue, any of those blue colors that are on the green yellow side will work. And just a touch of them though, just a little bit, and mostly white. And then I can come in and really get the feeling that there's a bright, overcast sky right above the canopy of all these trees. So you notice that on that stroke there was a lot of green in that. It looked much more brilliantly green than what I had in the sky. Nothing wrong with that. I don't have to suddenly go, oh no, what did I do? And rethink it, or maybe go in with my palette knife and scrape it out. This is the very beginning, initial stages, and as long as it feels like the color harmonizes with other colors that are in my painting, I'm going to be just fine. I don't want something that stands out as a color all unto itself, especially one brush stroke, because then, what did we say? It's going to demand attention because it's the only one like it, and it's just going to stand out to the viewer. So I don't want that necessarily, unless of course that brushstroke sometime becomes the focus of the painting. That's a different story. But in this case, that's not where I'm at with it. So as long as it doesn't stand out that way, I'm all right, and I can play with it. In this case, I blended it in with some of the other colors and diminished it a bit, but there's nothing wrong with even leaving it for a while just to see if maybe I'll bring in some more of that later on as I go in the painting. It might end up being the catalyst. I might say, wow, I really like that color, and then I start to do more of that in my painting. Those are what I call happy accidents. Yes, it was an accident maybe in the first instance of it. But then I think about it and I realize I like that and I can do more of it. So those are some of the things to think about as we paint. So here, notice I tried to put in a branch there to start coming in with maybe some thicker branches. But in these early stages, it felt way too stark. And I don't necessarily know if I want to have strong, dark branches up in that sky area, because those will really stand out. And I don't know if I want the viewer to be pulled to that high contrast area later in the painting. So while my paint is wet and I have the opportunity, I'm going back in and softening, really toning down the value and the contrast in that area and helping those, still bringing in some branches, but making sure that they feel like they're a ways away from the viewer, that they're being affected quite a bit by the atmosphere that's there. So right here you see I'm using a small brush, but a small brush it's not necessarily what I need to use. It just seemed convenient at the time. I have often done this with the larger brush that I have in my hand. So sometimes I can come in with a size 10 or 12 or a 6 or an 8 and do the same thing. And you notice here I'm using that small brush to create an even bigger tree trunk right there. But I don't, so sometimes I'll use a small brush just because I have it in my hand and it's convenient, or I might use a big brush to do small little branches because I have it in my hand and it's convenient. As long as our brushes have a nice sharp edge to them, we can get some of the, especially with the flats, we can get those small branches even with a big brush. So the reason why I wiped off the initial trunk is because it was boring. It was just a straight line down. And I realized immediately that that is not what I want in this painting. I want the trees, the trunk, all the different elements in here to really feel engaging, to have movement and rhythm, to feel like they're almost dancing with one another in there. So that's why I wiped that off and just, and you notice how when everything's wet, it's so easy to come back in and just mush some paint around and cover up something like that. No big deal at all. That's what I love about these initial stages, is I can change and move and transform at will. And that's just fun. So if we put something in like that and we think, wow, that was really boring, well, we can go in and change it again and make it whatever we want. So I'm glad that at this first initial step, I realized that I needed to change that, because even though these can be moved around and manipulated, I really want them to, once it's there, it's there. I'm not necessarily going to change it dramatically when I get into the painting. At least some of these will end up staying the way they are all the way to the very end of the painting. So I don't want to just say, well, that doesn't matter because it's just the beginning tree trunk and it won't, it'll all be covered up later. I don't know that. A lot of these tree trunks won't necessarily be covered up later. So right from the very beginning, I'm thinking in terms of engaging the viewer. What's going to be more fun, more interesting, without being too strong of themselves. All right. So what I mean by that is later in the painting, I might realize that I've just put in a tree trunk there that is really interesting and so fun to look at, and yet it's in a spot that I don't necessarily want to be a focal point. So then I have to change that. Even if it might just be the most spectacular tree trunk I've ever painted, if it's taking away from the main area of the painting where I want the viewer to look, then I have to get rid of it. I have to change it in some way, or I have to tone it down so it doesn't. So those are a lot of the things that I'm thinking about as I paint. And I've stuck with that small brush just because it was convenient. It had the same colors on it. I could go in and use it and know that I'm going to get a lot of the same reaction from it. So it was just a convenient thing to use at that moment. Now that I have a lot of those purplish lavender tree trunks in there, I want to start to vary things up and come in with some other trunks and shapes. So I also am changing up the color. I decided that I didn't want to come down that far into the foreground. I want to have some space there so it really rounds up and moves into the painting more. Mainly because I wanted a little bit of a dramatic movement up in the painting. And having it a little bit higher like that creates more drama. And what do we like in storytelling? We like drama. So if we can get more drama in our paintings, it's just going to help us. So you notice I don't necessarily do just one long fluid stroke all the way down. You notice how I kind of jerk and stop? Or when I stop, it's a little bit of a jerky motion right there. That is intentional. I'm doing that so I can kind of create those breaks in a tree where it goes from one angle to another angle. And often when there's a change from one angle to another angle, there's also a bit of a strong, like a knot there or something like that. So those little stilted movements, those are intentional. And that's to help create that feeling of change in that trunk. So this is where working with that white paint does get a little bit complicated. So it's wonderful when I really want the branches and twigs and leaves to intermingle and blend, and I can get those soft edges. But when I'm coming in and I want something to be a little more dark and dramatic, then that white will tend to fight against me. And this is where I have to remember that when I'm painting one color over another color, over a thick amount of paint that is still wet, I have to do it with plenty of paint on my brush, put the stroke down, and then leave it. And I understand that even at this point when I'm painting. It might not look like it from the start of that, but what I was really doing here, I wasn't worrying about so much the blending that's going on at the moment. I'm shaping that trunk. Once I get it completely shaped the way that I want it, and I know the direction I want to go with it, then I can come in with a strong, certain kind of stroke to it and leave it. But at this moment, I'm really just shaping out the directions I want them to go, the kinds of curves and plane changes that I want. All of that is what I'm working with at this moment. So I'm not too worried about getting the really dark color that I might want later on in the painting. So that very first one, it just happened to work out well, that the dark stuck and it was exactly the way I wanted that movement to go in that particular tree trunk. But that's not necessarily the way it works with each one of them. Even in the little tree trunks and wisps of trees that might be off in the distance, I can still have a variety of colors. And I try to keep often the values the same to an extent. Some values will be lighter, some will be darker, and that's with intent. I want there to be a variety of those values just because it helps to create that feeling of depth. It gives overlap, change of values, all of those things can help create distance and depth changes in our paintings. But I also want to have color temperature, warmer colors and cooler colors, and different changes in lots of the elements of art so that I can have variety, so it'll be more interesting for the viewer to look at. So in the beginning stages here, I can do a lot of that. So all of this that I'm doing right now is to create rocks and little bushes and other things that are in there, getting down some of the shadow colors that'll be part of those objects. And I'm thinking in terms of shapes. Remember, everything has direction to it. Even if it's kind of a big shape, it still has line. There's a movement, some kind of direction that is causing the viewer to move, causing the viewer to look. So with those shapes, even when it comes to a rock shadow, or even like a darker rock, maybe it's not the shadow of a rock, maybe it's just a rock that's darker in color tone overall, it's still going to have some kind of movement. And so you notice there's a really strong line down to that bottom left corner with the foreground triangle. So I have to be aware of that as I'm painting and make sure that it's not so strong that there aren't elements like that dark rock that are so strong that they point the viewer right on down and out of the painting. I'm going to, as I go along, try to create nuances in here, not necessarily with a definite path. It doesn't have to have a path. I could put a path in there, and that becomes a real obvious viewer guide, but I don't necessarily have to have a path. I can create a less obvious path just with values. So I might have a bright plane on a rock face that disrupts that movement, or I might have a bright clump of leaves that break up that movement. All of those things I'm thinking about as I start placing things within the different areas of the painting. How do I want to move the viewer around, and how am I going to get the viewer to move back into the painting? And then, of course, move around the painting as well. Not just move back into it, but I want them to constantly be moving around the painting. So this bluish green color that I put in there, this is all about now experimenting with color. I'm coming in with little remnants of color that I can get in there that will play against the other colors that are there. So I have all of these lavender blues, reddish lavenders, so some of those bluish greens and more warm greens like the olive greens. All of that then I can start to play with to see how those will harmonize with the other colors that are in there and create a variety that is fun and that will also make it feel as if we are outdoors in nature, and this is what we see all the time when we're out there. I especially want some of these greens to really help to balance all of the warm reds, oranges, and yellows that are going to be in there. So right now, I can place color just about anywhere and not be too concerned about it overall, because I can come back in pretty easily and place something over the top of it. I can change things around so readily at this moment that I might as well just have some fun with it. Start placing some colors around that can give me an idea of where I want to go with everything. How strong, how bright do I want colors to be? Just how much variety do I really want to have throughout the painting? So I can spend a lot of the real time involved can come in these initial stages here. Just figuring out a lot of those ideas of where I want to go with it and what's going to make that happen. So I have a vague idea in my mind of where I want to go with everything, but I'm open to any suggestions that the universe sends to me as I go along. You've seen this, I'm sure, in some of my other videos, but when I move my brush like that through the air, I'm drawing in the air. I want to kind of get an idea in my mind that way of what a particular stroke might look like, how it might affect the painting before I actually apply it to the panel. So now I'm just really kind of gently probing the idea of leaf structure. So even with that, there are several directions I could go. I could have really thick leaves everywhere throughout the painting and just have a lot of fun with it, especially with all that paint texture. When I have that much thick paint on there, I'm going to have a lot of texture in that paint, and that's really what I want with it. I want to get a lot of paint texture. When the viewer sees the original, they're going to see that paint texture and just go, oh yeah, this is a painting. That's really the idea, the feeling that I want to get in this painting. That's my primary objective, is that paint texture. And so within that paint texture, I want to have as much texture as there is going to be. I want to also have little subtle color shifts and changes without those color shifts and changes getting too obnoxious or feeling out of harmony one with another. So that's going to take some playing back and forth quite a bit throughout this painting to get that to all feel right. So even like right now, as I'm putting in all of this leaf texture and color in here, all these strokes, I want to have those strokes going in different directions, not just all in the same direction. And I don't want to get carried away and lose all of the lavenders that I have in here. And so I'm being a little bit careful at the moment until I really know what I want to achieve so that I don't lose something that would be hard to get back. Anything's possible. I can come back in, scrape something off, start all over again. I know that I can do that at any moment, but I don't want to if I can avoid it. So at this moment, I'm playing. Basically, I put in a shape or like a clump of leaves and colors, and then I might see how that feels in that spot, and then look at the rest of the painting and see if I put it in a clump somewhere else, how do I think that's going to affect it? So then I put in another clump of leaves somewhere, maybe a little bit different in color or in temperature. And then when I have that in the painting, I can then say, all right, so what did that do to the painting? And is there an area that now feels out of balance? And then I'll go to that area and maybe start adding in something in that area. So right now, you'll notice that I have the three main, there's almost like three little clumps that I've put in now. A little bit of a greenish yellow on the right, near that one diagonal tree trunk, and then the one that I'm close to right now with the more orangish yellow leaves, and then the reddish one over on the right, the reddish clump of leaves, and they're almost creating kind of a line there. But it does kind of curve a bit so that it moves the viewer down. That becomes then a line of movement. So when we talked about how I don't want that diagonal of the foreground mass to move the viewer right down to that bottom left corner, and move the viewer out of the painting. If I want to compensate for that, I have to come in with other lines as well. And they're basically lines of sight. It's what the viewer is going to see subconsciously. They won't necessarily realize what's happening, but those will help to lead the viewer back into the painting. It doesn't have to be a line. It doesn't have to be like a branch that comes in and moves the viewer. It might be a series of clumps of something. It may be a bush and a rock and a clump of leaves that all work as in creating a line that moves the viewer. So you can see that there are a lot of things that I'm thinking about, but they all kind of tie together, all these things that we're talking about. The shapes all tie together because the shapes create movement in the painting, and the shapes help break up the panel. They break up the overall painting, and we have to decide how we want to break up that painting. Sometimes some people will just put in 2 major shapes. Maybe they'll have 5 or 10 major shapes that break up a painting. In this case, I had really the 3 that we started with, and now I'm coming in and breaking up those shapes so that they don't feel like 3 obvious shapes, but that those 3 shapes kind of start to integrate with one another. With the little brush right now, I have fun sometimes with just mark making. And by that I mean just a line, something high contrast, something that will become later on a shadow. So I put in these dark marks. I don't know what they might end up becoming. It might become a branch that's laying on the ground. It might become the shadow of a clump of leaves that's on the ground. It might become the shadow of a rock that's there. But it's really just mark making. I'm making these lines that are going in different directions. They're different shapes, they're different sizes, different values. And with those, I can start to break up those spaces. And I can have those there later to really help me get the feeling of reality. So light and dark. And it starts to create that 3-dimensional effect in my painting. The fun thing about putting in a lot of those little branches and tree trunks in the very beginning is that I can then, as I go along, take some of them and develop them up even more. And I can do that now because some of them are light. All of them were very light in value. And because of that, some of them will feel like they really go off and recede off into the distance, into that misty, foggy kind of atmosphere. And others I can start to really pull forward. But at this stage, rather than committing myself to something right in the beginning, I can start to develop those up as I fill out the overall composition. How does the painting feel overall? And will a tree trunk right here, if I do this one, will it contribute, if it comes forward, will it really contribute to the overall balance in the painting? So if I have a really strong diagonal right here, like the one that I have there in the middle of the painting, if I develop that up more strongly, and it's kind of a diagonal that almost cuts the painting in half right there, what do I need to do to balance that out, to make sure that that doesn't cut the painting in half and that everything still moves back and forth in the painting? And I also want to have some of these tree trunks that help to break up that diagonal line of the foreground that leads to that bottom left corner. I can do that with some of these tree trunks by making sure that I don't just have one line of strong trees all the way down that foreground line, that diagonal line. If I have just a constant, all the trees are lined up on that diagonal line, then it's going to really be strong and it will push the viewer right out of the painting. But if I start to move one trunk forward from that line a little bit and one trunk back behind that line a little bit, then suddenly I've broken up that line and I can start to move the viewer zigzagging back into the painting. Those are a lot of the things that can help us to have a dramatic line like that and still not have it overpower the painting. So you notice I put in those really dark shadows down in the foreground. Well, now I can start to come in also with some brights and see how far to push the bright in the painting. And I want to get some of these really bright spots too back in there in the early stages, so that as I come in with thicker canopy, thicker groups of leaves, I have some of that to work its way through and create the feeling of sky, little holes of sky that are poking through. Now I do have to watch some of that. I might have to tone some of that down later depending on where those clumps are, because if we have a hole in the tree canopy that is too bright, it becomes a spotlight, and then that doesn't work. Even if it's the same value as the overall sky that we have in there, if it's small, remember, when we have one small spot of bright within a much larger, darker area, then it becomes then a high contrast, and that demands attention. And the relativity of that dark around it will make it feel even brighter than it otherwise might be. And that's why a lot of what we're dealing with here is relative. It's relative to everything else around it. And much of what I'm doing here too is breaking up shapes. So we have within that larger rectangle shape in the middle ground, we have shapes of lavender that I put in there. Well, I want to break those shapes up. I want it to feel like they are, by the end of the painting, that they are canopies or they're clumps and groups of leaves that are broken up with bits of sky coming through. And if I do that right now, then a lot of that will become variety later on in my painting. I'm also playing a bit with the overall key of the painting, just seeing how bright I really want to go all the way around the painting. Now, oftentimes when I do a bright white, I might add a little bit of a cadmium red or something like that to it, because that is one of the brightest whites I can get. But adding a little bit of yellow here, I like the use of the yellow and the white in this instance, because it's a nice harmonizing color for all of those lavenders. The purple and gold, they are opposites on the color wheel, and if I can get the right type of color, the right type of yellow to work with the lavenders that I have there, then they will really create a nice harmony that is kind of electric. It adds more energy and vigor to the painting. Okay, so it's been now, part of what's happening with this painting is that I have other projects going on as well, videos that I'm doing for the monthly membership, so I don't always get to paint on this right straight through. Generally speaking, especially when I'm painting full time and I'm not teaching as much, I like to take one painting and work on it right on through until it's finished. But now that I'm doing so much with the courses, I have to take a lot more breaks sometimes in between. And so now a lot of the thick paint that I'm working with is going to start drying out. You can see that my palette, it changed a bit. I had to scrape off some of that paint that was already starting to dry on my palette. And it is a different approach a bit when I'm working on top of layers that are drying or that dry out on me, as opposed to the alla prima where everything's nice and wet. I like working alla prima because I feel like I have a lot more possibilities with it. But there is each technique that we use, whether it's alla prima or working one dry layer on top of another, each one has its pros and cons. The nice thing about working on top of a dry layer is that I don't lose any of, I can take my color, mix it exactly to the value and the color that I want, lay it down, and nothing else is going to affect it. And I can do some dry brushing on top of that that's nice and easy. I don't have to worry about mixing, I can go back in and manipulate that a little bit, and I know that I'm not going to pull all of those undercolors up into it. So that's nice when I can have that. But at the same time, working alla prima, I can manipulate the edges more easily. I can blend things together. I can lay in a stroke that I want to have dark and have it stay there and not touch it again, and know that it will work that way, while at the same time really having the end of that stroke maybe just dissolve out into all of that other thick paint that I have on there. There's just, each one is a good thing to experiment with, to see what works for us, and each painting is different. Every painting we do will be a little bit different from another one that we've done. That's why we're not doing formula painting here. And so each one is a new problem to solve. It's a new puzzle. And we get to make up the puzzle as we go along. That's what I love about painting. It's all problem solving. It's all fun. It's challenging and engaging, and it just keeps our senses so heightened all the time. So right now, you can see I'm going in. I'm starting to create that foliage for the foreground. All of those leaves that have been falling. Some of them maybe for years they've been falling on the ground. And they just keep on building up that area. So I kind of think of that idea of years of things falling and building on one on top of another when I'm painting. And I can do that with my paint. I can come in with one color, put it in different places around the area, go in and change the color up a bit, the value or the color temperature, or just the color itself, and start to lay that in different places around the painting so that it kind of creates a harmony. And just start layering it one on top of another, or one color placed next to it to another, and just really work with it that way. Start building up the feeling of all of those layers of things, leaves and branches that have fallen and have started to decay on the forest floor. So when I start working back into the background like that, I really have to be careful, because if I get my color too warm, then it's going to really move forward, because I have a lot of cool back there. So if I have a lot of cool already as the major shape that's back there, when I place a warm on it, that warm's going to pop forward. If the background was mostly warm and I place a cool within it, then that cool is going to pop forward. See how that works? So it's not necessarily that warms advance and cools recede. Sometimes that is the case. But often it's that the contrast, the one that is different, is the one that advances and the others recede. In this case, I have a cooler lavender color that creates a large shape in that background, in that left side, lower left side. And so when I come in with warmer on top of that, then I have to be careful, because that will start to, that warmer color will really start to come forward. And I don't want it to necessarily come forward. I want to have warm and cool colors in there, really interacting with one another and creating an energy in it. But I want those warm colors to not be so strong that they feel like they're just as close to us as all the warm colors that are in the major triangle of that foreground foliage. And sometimes that just takes some manipulation of it, going in and changing it up a little bit. It might just sometimes be just a small little subtle change to it in either value or color temperature that does it. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a dramatic change. We don't have to go in and scrape it off and say, oh, that just didn't work. It might just be that we just need to lay a little bit of a cooler color on top of it, and suddenly then it works. So here you can see that a lot of the paint is still wet. That white paint especially back there is still wet, and my brush is still picking it up. If I go back in and try to rework a stroke I put down, it pulls all that white back up into it. And I like that to a degree. I get a bit of a striation that way in my colors. You see that it creates almost like a bark texture on those trees. So that's a lot of fun. That's part of what I was wanting to experiment with in this painting, was to see how well that striation will work with that thick paint. And experimenting doesn't necessarily mean it's always going to be successful. Sometimes our experiments fail, and that's all right. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, that's a good thing. Everything that we do, whether it's a failure or a seeming success, it's all a success for us, because as artists, it's adding to our repertoire of knowledge and techniques and understanding that will help us to create even better and stronger paintings as we go along. If we're afraid to experiment, then our paintings are eventually going to become boring. We're going to get bored with it. Our viewers are going to get bored with it, because we won't be progressing. We have to progress as artists. We can't stay still. We're either going backwards or we're going forwards in our development. There is no middle ground. We can't just stay at one point, because eventually what was fresh and exciting for us and worked at that level, if we stay at that level, then our movements will become even more stiff as we go along, because we won't feel energized by what we're doing anymore. And that lack of energy will show up in our paintings. Even if we feel like we're at the same level, we won't be. We'll start to go backwards. We'll start to regress in our abilities. So we have to constantly be pushing forward, trying to learn something new, trying to push our own boundaries. And as we do that, we're going to be engaged, we're going to be having fun, and it's going to be exciting for us. And that's what's going to keep us getting out there in front of the easel. We're going to want to do it every day, because we're going to think, wow, I have something to go discover today. And I am excited about that. So right here, you notice I'm thinking in terms of, remember how I talked about just a little while ago about that diagonal, that strong triangle, the line on there that creates that diagonal down to the lower left corner. Now I'm really in earnest in breaking up that line by having a few tree trunks that are still visible, even though they're pushing a little bit of ways from us. They're going to still be visible there in higher contrast, so that I can have some coming a little bit closer to the viewer, some pushing farther away from the viewer, and break up that line. And by doing that, that will help to lead the viewer in and around and through the painting. I really have to try to watch for strong lines in my painting, whether it's created by a lot of big shapes or a lot of small shapes, or just a line of trees going down a diagonal foreground shape. Whatever it is that's creating a line in my painting, I have to make sure that I want that line there. Because that line, all the lines in our painting are going to lead the viewer's eye. They're going to lead us around the painting. So we want to make sure that if there's a line there that's leading us around, that we want that movement. We want that direction of the eye. We want it to go that direction. If there's a line in our painting, no matter what's causing it, that we don't like, it's leading the viewer in a direction we don't want the viewer to go, then we have to figure out how to break up that line. And these tree trunks, they become very strong lines, very obvious lines in the painting. And I will manipulate them throughout. I might have one that I think I have developed it up, and I love it, and it just works great. And then as the painting progresses, suddenly it is not in the right spot, or it's too big, or it's too small. Something about it, no matter how much I love it, I'm going to have to change it. So, you notice with that one that I just put down, I could have done just about so many different things with it. I could have taken it in a strong diagonal to the right. I could have taken it behind that tree right there and made it those two separate trees. And at the moment that I was drawing it, the moment I was painting it with a paintbrush, or drawing it with a paintbrush, I decided to connect them and see what would happen if I had a V-shaped tree with two branches coming off of it right there. And then I thought, well, maybe it'll end up becoming just one, and I like this one better, rather than the diagonal there. Maybe I want that to contrast a little bit with the direction some of the other trees are moving already. So that's what I'm thinking about when I put in a branch or a trunk like that. What does the painting need? What lines do I need to create at this moment to help balance out other areas in the painting? So I have a lot of very strong grays and lavenders with the tree trunks. I have some of those reddish lavender colors in there as well, but I want to get some that are a bit warmer, just a bit, compared to what I have in there right now. So as I go along, I'm picking up more and more white paint on the end of my brush, and that is lightening the value of the paint that I have on there. So I continue to use that. Rather than thinking, oh, my color is all full of white now, it doesn't matter. I can still keep going in and putting in lighter and lighter branches back in there just to use what's on my brush. Because it's a good color, I like it, and it'll work well in the painting. I'm using it in that one spot, so it'll work well in other spots. It'll just be a little bit lighter in value. Same color, lighter in value. Now, as the white starts to add to it, of course, that's going to cool that color a little bit too, which is good because then it'll help to push that off into the distance more. And I'm really having a lot of fun with that little round brush that I'm using. It's actually a mongoose round. I think it's about a size 6 or 8. And with all the small branches that I want to have in this painting, it's just kind of convenient to have a brush like that at this moment. So I have stuck with that brush quite a bit throughout this painting. And it's fun to use. But you notice how far back on that brush I'm holding it? I'm really right there at the very end of the brush, not up towards... You'll see some artists that'll hold it more in the middle. I like to hold it back on the back of the brush. Not always, but often, because it dances more. It gets its own movement, and it's more fluid for me that way. It takes away some of the stiffness that I might otherwise get in my strokes. And it's kind of fun to see just what happens sometimes when it suddenly shifts over somewhere in a direction I wasn't expecting. That's just fun. It's a happy accident. A kind of a happy intentional accident, I think. So here we go. I'm thinking again. Notice how this is another way to break up that diagonal line. There's nothing wrong with that diagonal line, remember. I wanted that drama in there. But I'm also manipulating that drama just a bit. So coming in with some big rock shapes and other contrasts in the foreground, I can create new lines of movement. So I decided that maybe I should put in some lighter planes. I have all these darker rocks, And almost like there's a little pile of rocks right there that are also being covered over by leaves and other debris, forest debris that's in there. So I just play back and forth with values and colors. You notice I started taking some of those branches in a more horizontal direction. That's all just an attempt to get variety in there. That's all. And I have to watch the horizontal branches like that because they will sometimes cut the painting into sections. And I might not necessarily like the kind of section that it creates, the shape or the feeling that comes from that. So there, I just easily tone that down to see what that would be like if I had the top of that kind of start to fade off into the distance. I didn't like that. I decided I wanted to have that tree trunk there, so I just grabbed some stronger color and pull that up into there. And because that tree trunk is close to the middle of the painting, I do not want that to be nearly as large as that diagonal big tree that's right on the left of it. I want to make sure that that's kind of the focal point now of the painting, but I don't want it to be an obvious focal point. I want it to be a focal point in that it helps to pull the viewer into that area so the viewer can walk back into the woods, but it's going to be a little bit farther back. It's going to be more obscure than some of the other trees, but it still creates a placement there that helps the viewer to move back in there, right front in the middle of the painting. It creates a break there. We move back in there. So I want that strong enough that it does that. It moves the viewer back, but not so strong that it suddenly becomes the dominant force in the painting. But it will help to balance out a bit that strong, because this large diagonal tree there on the left of it will be a lot darker and stronger in color and value than just about any other tree in the painting, especially because it's the biggest tree in there and it has that diagonal lean to it. That demands a lot of attention. So I didn't want to have it right in the middle of the painting, but I do want this other one to help balance that so that we're not just stuck on that one tree. Pay close attention to my palette, that with the trees and the branches, I'm really staying close to clean lavender color, blues and reds for the most part, not the browns, not the transparent oxide colors, because I want them to be a harmony to the oranges and yellows and warm colors in my painting. Okay, so it's been a little while since I got to work on this painting because I got involved with having the need to edit other videos for the membership site. So my paint is now dry. All of that white, I can no longer work within it. It is dry and there's nothing that's going to change that now. So I am now working no longer alla prima, but I am working in layers. But now I can come in with really strong color and it's not going to be affected by any of the underlying colors. And this will be a lot of fun now because I can come in with some dry brushing and I've got all that texture that was created initially with all the, especially just even from that initial, when I put the white down and I used a bristle brush to create brush texture going in different directions. That now is there. I have all that texture and I can just drag my brush lightly across some of that and it creates this really fun breakup of color. So I'm going to be using that to the full extent that I can now. We use everything that we're working with to the advantage that we have at that moment. Now that everything's dry, the advantage is that it's dry and I can, the texture as I paint over the top of it, I'm not going to lose that texture. It'll stay there. And I can also come in and if something doesn't work, I can come back in and wipe some of that out again because it's been dry now for I think about a month or so. Things are dry enough that even if I come in and I take a paper towel with some walnut oil and try to wipe out something that I don't like, I can do that. I can't get too vigorous with it, but I can get vigorous enough that I can take off some color that I might not like if I put something down on there. Now, of course, I could always just paint over the top of it as well, but it does give me a lot of opportunities that I didn't have when it was alla prima, when it was wet on wet. So now it's going to be just building up lots of different colors that vary in value, not necessarily dramatically. Sometimes it might be subtly, just small changes in value, and it might also be strong, very dramatic changes in value. I want to get a variety of that. And color temperature. I want to have warm and cool and degrees of it, not necessarily the same thing, not necessarily really contrasting warm and cool, but maybe just subtle variations of warm and cool placed next to each other so they can really start to vibrate and create that feeling of just a dramatic, oh wow, the colors are just so beautiful at this time of the year, that sort of feeling and look in it. So now I can really start to go with abandon, going very quickly to a degree with getting some of that color and value change all throughout the painting. And I'm using this large Series 103 from Utrecht. It's that extra long filbert. I love that. It's a bristle brush, so it's got the nice texture from the bristles. And it's one of my, when I have a larger painting like this and a lot of foliage, and I want the foliage to have a really nice random feeling to it, that extra long filbert just is amazing for that. Because those bristles are so long and they have so much spring to them and so much texture that can come from them because they are a nice hog bristle, that I can really get some movement and variety. I can start to just push that brush around and it's going to do all kinds of fun stuff. The colors that I had on my palette were from a previous painting, and actually I used the same experiment as I did in this painting, using that thick white to begin with. It was a small one. We have that in the monthly membership, but I had those left over and wanted to continue with those same colors because I would be using a lot of that in the foliage in this painting. So that's where it started. Sorry you didn't see me necessarily mix those colors in this painting, but you'll get the feeling for it as we go along. So you notice I put in that dark thing of green, and I didn't go in and cover it all up because then I get that feeling of light and shadow. And it starts to create the idea of a bush there without really having to do very much to create that feeling of a bush. Now I can play with some of those darks and lights that I have in the foreground and start to build that out and really create the feeling of three-dimensional objects in my painting. And since my light source is fairly cool, I am keeping the shadows, especially at the base of the rocks where they meet the ground, on the warmer side rather than on the cool blue side of the spectrum. So that's not a hard and fast rule. It's just something that I keep in mind when the light is cool. And I can really start to play with the contrasts in these tree trunks to see where I want to go with that. So this, I'm playing with the diagonal nature of this tree trunk here to kind of counter or balance that other strong diagonal large tree that I have. I don't know exactly what I want here yet. Oh, and I like these colors, these fun, more reddish crimson colors in here. It's almost a fluorescent feeling is what it is. And I like that, bringing some of those reds like that, they really stand out and just give some punch in areas. Now I have to be careful because they might have too much punch and demand a lot of attention that I don't necessarily want going to a small space like that. But at the same time, if I do it right, it can really add some drama in there that isn't obvious, but it's enough that it stimulates the attention of the viewer and gets them engaged in the painting. When I put in some colors like that are so brilliant and stand out and such stark contrast to everything else around them, I generally don't leave them like that, but it's kind of in the realm of the beginning colors that we put in. There might be remnants of that show through and just give sparkle to the painting. So sometimes they end up working. I might put more of that throughout the painting and I leave it like that. But for the most part, most of the paint like that really stands out is just for small effects, little stimulating bits of color in the painting that will help to enliven things and really energize the painting overall. As I get more time, this is actually a theme that I want to explore a lot more. I loved what happened with this painting, and I plan on doing even more with it, exploring the whole idea of it further with that really thick texture and the colors and how that all worked out. And I want a nice still blue gray kind of color for this, using a little bit of the ultramarine blue, some blue black, and the alizarin crimson. And that blue black, any cooler black with some blue in it will pretty much do the same thing. See that little wiggle in the brush? That is intended to get different kinds of texture in there so that it feels like it just changes up my stroke a little bit, just for that variety. Always thinking of how can I make it just a little bit different than it was before. Now with all of this, I have to decide how much I want one tree trunk to come forward and how much I want it to push back. So I'm going to be thinking about that as I go here. Do I really want that one to be as strong and dark as the big one, the diagonal one? And I decide no, I want to actually have this other one that I'm working on now push back a little bit farther. Even though they aren't that much different in where they are in proximity to the viewer, it's a psychological kind of effect. So if I tone that down with my values, then it psychologically feels as if it's going farther away and the other is coming closer to the viewer. And now I can start to really pick out different tree trunks and other things in the painting and decide which ones I want to start to develop up more. I'll usually take just a few, maybe one or two or four particular objects in my painting and really develop the detail in them to a greater extent than what I will in the rest of the painting. And that then, same thing, psychologically, it tells the viewer that this is the kind of detail that is everywhere in the painting without having to put it everywhere in the painting. And that way I keep the focus in certain spots, and then the viewer's mind, their imagination fills in the detail in the rest of the areas of the painting. If I put that same kind of detail and finish everywhere, then the viewer really has nothing to do and they get a little bit more bored. But if I give them something for their imagination to grasp onto, then it's more engaging. It's more fun for the viewer. So here I'm really working with the texture that we got when I first put in those initial strokes. I have that paint texture. Remember when I was working with it, I was working with all that thick paint, so there are little ridges of paint here and there. And so I'm really working with that now to create the feeling of light and dark and the idea of bark texture and the kind of texture we might see in an old gnarled tree that's out in the woods. Now, it can also be problematic when we do want to have a more continuous stroke and all that paint texture breaks up the stroke all the way along. That can be frustrating. It actually takes more work that way, and it's part of the reason why I prefer alla prima. because then I can choose how much dry brushing technique I want to use or how little, and I can get one continuous stroke in there. Now I can start to really build up the different spaces in the painting with a lot of branches and leaves, and so as I do that, I'm thinking about movement, of course. That's kind of always a given, but also variety of direction and shape and size. So I don't want all the trees to feel like they're spaced the same distance apart from each other. I want to have some where, like with the tree trunk that I just put in there, that small one, it creates a little grouping of those trees that is different than other groupings that might be in the painting. I want to have it feel unpredictable, the way that the trees are spaced apart from each other and the types of trees that are around one another. Really still working on that kind of variety in there. And then as I start to put in leaf structure, especially clumps of leaves, bigger areas of leaves, or even a single leaf, I can come in and break up a tree trunk with those leaves so that I can either start to push the trunk back more, or I can start to pull something more forward, make one tree trunk more obvious and central to the focal point of the painting, or start to diminish some others just with the layering of leaves. And you can see how I'm going back and forth between the warmer, bright reds and oranges and yellows, and then using white to cool down those colors so that I can get a mix of the warm and cool all throughout the leaf groupings as well. I love to have that variety, and I build it up in those layers as I go. Warm and cool and warm and cool. And that helps then to approximate more of what I'd see out in nature. If I have everything the same intensity, the same color temperature, the same value, then it just all gets lost in the jumble. And it has a tendency to flatten the image. So if I come in and I put in areas of leaf structure in places and I start to feel like it's just too much, that I've lost some of the background atmosphere, then I'll just mix up a color that approximates what I already have in there, the lavenders that I had there, and break up some of that leaf structure. And I want to start to pull some of that color that's in the background and pull it forward so that I start to integrate the different spaces in my painting together. So bringing some of that lavender, the bright lavender that's in the background, I can pull that in as if the sky is reflecting onto a flat plane of a rock, or maybe a group of leaves is catching the light just right and it reflects some of that lavender atmosphere into it. I can pull a lot of that down into even the foreground. That way I can get a nice variety of light and dark down in my foreground as well. Now, I don't want it to feel like there's necessarily a puddle of water or something like that there that's reflecting that sky. Or maybe I do. There might be a puddle of water there. I just want it to be more of a contrast rather than anything in particular. It could be the plane of a rock. It could be a puddle of water. As long as it works in the space that it's in the spot that I place it, and doesn't demand too much attention. If it's too bright and it doesn't feel like it's integrating well with the shapes around it or the values or the colors, whatever contrasts around it, then I have to change that so that it isn't taking too much attention to it. So you notice with little branches like that, if I lay them over the top of some of those trunks, just by virtue of that layering, it will start to push those tree trunks farther away and pull other tree trunks closer to us. And then I'm really going to start working with light and dark in here. So I don't have a necessarily strong, here's the light side and here's the dark side in this, or the shadow side, I should say. They're going over to the dark side. Now I won't necessarily have a strong light and shadow side in any of the objects that are in this painting, because it is a nice diffused, overcast light sky that's out there. And that's fun because then I can focus a lot more on color. When it's more of that diffused lighting in there and an overcast sky, the colors tend to be more dramatic, more brilliant. When the light is really bright, like with the sunlight, then it tends to bleach out. The light obscures the color. But in the case of an overcast sky, the colors really come forward. They become more brilliant and saturated. And that's one of the things I love about these atmospheric days. So you can see I've grabbed my 103 brush again, the extra long filbert, and this is about variety here. I'm really starting to build up layers, and to a degree I want just a bunch of small little shapes, little spots of color all throughout it for huge variety. I really want to push the variety while still having them feel like they belong together as a grouping. But when it comes to leaves are always, they're going in all these different directions, and so they're catching the light in different ways. So when we look at a leaf, the top of the leaf has different texture than the bottom of a leaf usually. And the light reacts with them differently from the top side to the bottom side of a leaf. We can utilize that in our paintings for variety. So, in the case of, let's say a leaf is dramatically facing away from us and the light is coming through it, then we might get some kind of a really fun translucent color that is there. Just slight changes in the turning or the angle of a leaf can really give us dramatic or stunning changes in the color and color temperature of those leaves, and gives us a lot to work with within the groupings of our leaves. As far as color goes, it's the same thing when I paint rose leaves. There's a difference between the front and the back and the way the light comes through it. And there's especially a difference when either the front or back of a leaf that is catching the light and we see that light on it as it's reflecting onto the leaf, as opposed to diffusing through the leaf. There's a big change in the type of light that we see, the type of color, the value that's there. When the light is diffusing through a leaf, the color is going to be much more saturated and rich. When a light is reflecting on a leaf, we're going to see much more of the actual light, the color of the light, the way that we would see it in the sky, or the type of light source that we are working with. We're going to see that color on the leaf. Or we'll see the color of the light source diluting the color of the leaf in proportion to how much is reflecting towards the viewer. So that's where we can get so much variety within a clump of leaves. One leaf might be facing more towards the light, and we see just almost the color of the sky reflected on it. Another one might be facing the light, and we see the light diffusing through it. Another one, we might just see the light catching the edge of a leaf. So that's why we can move light all around, so we can get light and shadow, little spots of darker value in there, little spots of lighter value, stronger color, more diffused color, or desaturated color, especially using white. White is going to cool that color down, and it's going to lighten it. It's going to desaturate the color. So adding white to it to make it lighter, that's going to change the color temperature and the saturation of the color. The same thing with if we add dark to it, The darker we get, the less color we're going to see in it. But we can get a whole lot of color within our darker colors as well. In fact, we can get some really rich looking color in a lot of our shadows if we pay attention to the kind of shadow that we have there. Because sometimes we also get some reflected light that gets in there into those shadows. And it might be nice and warm. It depends on our light source, of course, as to whether that reflected light's going to be warmer or cooler. It also depends on what that light is reflecting off of. So if it's reflecting off of something that's warm, the reflected light, that whatever it's bouncing off of actually becomes a source of light. So rather than the direct light source itself, it's the reflection of that light source. And so that light that's reflecting off, if it's reflecting off of something that's warm, then suddenly the light that's reflecting becomes warmer than it might have been originally. And vice versa. If it's reflecting off of something that's cooler in color, it might become a much cooler light source than it was originally. All of those things, that's where direct observation is very handy. The more we're outside painting from life, or even in our studios painting from life, the more attuned we will become to the nature of our light source and how it reacts with different situations, such as reflecting off an object into a shadow or something like that. So with all of these things that I'm doing now, putting in these little branches and other things, I'm thinking about that. The idea that there is a whole symphony of colors and values and color temperatures that's happening within a woodland scene. And I'm utilizing that to its fullest if I can, if my imagination works with me. So I still go back and forth with this particular tree trunk as far as the value of it, how strong I want the contrast. And you can see just from, if you look at the final image, that I finally decide to push that back in there. But because everything is relative, that's part of the reason why I go back and forth so much with different elements within the painting. Because I might build up, like right now, building up the strong contrast within this tree, it then changes the feeling of balance within the overall painting. And so then I have to, it's not a, oh, if I do this, then it's, of course I do that. There's no of course, it's a matter of feeling. And balance within a painting is not a formula, because there are way too many variables involved for us to have a formula. They're just, you can see already that there are thousands and thousands of brushstrokes involved in this, and each one of those can change the whole feeling of a painting. So there's no formula. We just have to, once we do something, think, okay, what has that done to the painting now? Step back from it, analyze it, think about it, and just get an overall feeling for the harmony within the painting, and think, okay, what's needed now? What will help to balance this? Is what I just did, this really strong tree in here, is that overpowering? Is the rest of the painting benefited by it, or is it harming what else I might have in there? Is it distractive? Is it so powerful that nothing else can compete with it and the viewer has nowhere else to go? Well, rather than necessarily toning it down right now, I also have to keep in mind all of the leaf structure that I plan to add in there and try to envision in my mind what I think that's going to do to that particular tree trunk. And that will help me then to know whether or not to keep it at that high contrast or whether I should tone it down right now. So in this case, I know that a lot of the color I'm going to be putting into this painting is going to help to balance that out. So I'm going to leave it for now, but with the awareness that I might have to tone it down later if all of the stuff that I put in doesn't balance it out, if it doesn't counter the strength of that dark object, that dark shape. And then I can just go into other tree trunks and do the same thing. So you notice how I'm also getting a variety of warm and cool within those tree trunks. So with the really dark diagonal one, I put in some reds on it, because even an object like a tree or a tree trunk, it can have color that is reflected onto it by all the surrounding colors. All those red and orange leaves, they can actually, the light can come and bounce off of those and reflect a color onto that tree. So I utilize that knowledge by putting in the tree overall has a cooler blue-gray tone to it. Well, I can get some nice warmer crimson or red colors in it as well, with the idea that those colors are bouncing into that tree. It could also just be a leaf that fell onto the tree trunk and is stuck there. It could be about anything, but really it's about getting that warm and cool color temperature variety in there. It just creates an energy that I like, and it breaks up things. It doesn't become so monotonous. So I'm doing that even in tree trunks that might be farther away, but not so strongly. The colors are desaturated more, and it's not as powerfully done. Once I start to get in a lot of the shapes like this, I love little tree trunks like that are just a strong contrast, but they're so thin that they really create a reality in the painting that I enjoy a lot. They're smaller details, but they are a lot of fun for me. And then again, I don't want to get carried away with those, because then it kind of loses it. If I have one here and there, then it really adds to the drama and the scene that I'm working on. But if I put them everywhere, then they lose their effect, because then it just becomes noise in there rather than a nice, fun, interesting change or unexpected element, something that's different from everything else. It just becomes then something that's just like everything else. I want to have variety. I don't want to have everything be everywhere. And you notice when I first started to paint that trunk in the smaller one, not the one that I just did, the top, but the one right before that, I stopped and I hesitated, and then I kind of drew in the air. That was so that I could kind of play with the idea of angles and see what I wanted there. Do I want to have a vertical, a diagonal, a horizontal? I just wanted to make sure before I committed to it that I knew where I was going with it. So now I can really start to build up some of those fun leaves in there, getting brighter, more saturated colors mixed in with some grayed down leaf structure. And really, all of this, all that it's about is that I get to play with warm and cool color juxtapositions. One warm next to a cool, and a light next to a dark. And it doesn't really matter whether it's leaves or something else. The leaves just give me the opportunity to play with color and to play with contrast. But if I just suddenly go gung-ho and put everything everywhere, then I might lose something in the painting. So sometimes I just let my instincts kind of take over, and I paint with abandon, not really paying a whole lot of attention intellectually to what I'm doing, just letting my feelings guide me at that moment. And I might go in it really with gusto, just boom, 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 with a lot of energy. And then I stop. And that's when I have to walk back in my studio, take a breather, think about what has just happened, really look at it and analyze it, usually I'll turn around away from my painting, walk back in my studio a good 15, 20 feet, turn around again and try to get a fresh eye on it. What does it look like when I turn around at that moment? What's my impression? And see if anything stands out. If there's a clump that I just put in that doesn't fit, if there's something that I liked earlier, a freshness or something that was in there that I lost in that moment of abandon, I analyze that, because I can come back in and capture that back while I'm thinking about it. If I continue with the painting, I will forget what was there before, and then it will be gone. But if I see it in that moment and realize, oh, I lost that and I liked that, then I can come back at that moment and replace it, either by repainting it, scraping off or wiping off what I just put on there. Whatever it takes, I can do what I need to get that back at that moment while I'm thinking about it. So even with smaller little trunks and branches, like the one that's leaning, that's kind of curving over right there with the weight of its own leaves that it can't handle yet until it gets a little bit more mature as a tree, I can come in with light and dark areas of tree bark and just the angles and planes on that tree and have fun with it. I don't want to get carried away and I don't want those little areas of light and dark contrast on that tree, especially on a small one like that, to be too sharp edged necessarily, because if I have a really hard edge, that means that that's going to attract the viewer more. If I break up the edges a lot, then it will feel more natural. It'll blend in with the things around it. So what I'm doing here is getting movement with light and dark. Just coming in and putting in little dabs here and there, maybe a brush stroke. You notice how that brush stroke earlier with the dark, I didn't just go straight down in a straight line kind of brush stroke with it. I had some movement in that brush stroke, a little bit of curve and angle to it. So those are some of the things that can be a lot of fun to put in. Now these blues that I'm coming in here with, it's a much cooler color, and I'm doing that to suggest that there are little plants in there, maybe some bushes that are filtering all the way through the landscape in there, but also to kind of create that energy of warm and cool next to each other. So the lavenders overall, compared to the oranges and the reds, are definitely cooler on the color temperature spectrum. But when we contrast that blue, that bluish green color with those lavenders, the bluish green are even cooler than the lavenders in the background, and they by contrast make those lavenders warm. So that's what we were talking about when we mention relativity all the time. It is all relative. It depends on what's a color's value and color temperature, and even the color itself are relative depending on what's around it, because what's around it can change the way the color looks. An orange might not even look orange anymore depending on the colors that are around it. So coming in with that bluish green in there can really help to get some energy going in some of those spaces. And I don't like to necessarily just work on one spot in a painting, finish it off, go on to the next spot, finish it off. I'm all over the painting. I'm constantly going back and forth to different spots in here so that everything feels balanced as I go along, as much as is possible. Of course, we already mentioned that sometimes I have in my mind what's going to happen towards the end of it, so that, like in the case of that diagonal tree that's so dark, I know that I can leave that high contrast there and it will get balanced out eventually. But other areas, I also have balance within other areas that needs to be addressed as I go along, and I want to build that up as a whole, not just as parts. Finish this part, go on to that next part. I want to finish it off as a whole painting. All of the parts working together in tandem. So I get light and dark on those, warm and cool. And when I think about warm and cool, often I'm thinking about whether I'm thinking about the color temperature of my light source and whether that light source is hitting directly on an object or a plane of an object, or if it's hitting indirectly, if maybe some light is reflecting into it. That's where I can get the warm and cool color temperature shifts. So that gets a little bit complicated. It's something that we work into as the more we paint, the more we observe outside, the faster those nuances will become apparent to us and get lodged in our memories. But after a while, it starts to become almost second nature to us a bit. So I can come in and place, let's say, well, in this case, I just now put that little plane change on the bottom where the curve is coming under and is facing towards the ground. I actually put what was kind of a cooler color temperature right there. I could have done that warmer as well, because the warmth from all the leaves on the ground could have been reflecting up into that plane change and making that warm in color temperature right there. In that case, I chose to do it cooler compared to the lavender that's right below it, but that was because I was trying to contrast against the lavender that was right below it. But hopefully that gives you an idea of, if I wasn't trying to contrast against that lavender that's right below it, I could have actually used all of the foliage down on the ground as a reflector, reflecting warm light up into that plane change. That plane, and by plane, I'm talking about the different planes on objects. So if it was a square, each side of a square is a different plane. Some planes are facing the sky, some planes are facing the ground, like the one that's right underneath the square. If it's sitting on the ground, that plane is obviously facing the ground. Others are facing other directions. Those are the planes that I'm talking about. And even something that's round has different planes on it when you think about where those areas on that ball are facing, or that round object. So with a tree trunk, even if it's a round cylindrical object, it still has different planes on it. And where there's a curve change, that's a different plane. It's facing the light differently. And that's where I have a lot of fun with those, because I can really push the dark and light value shifts, and I can push the color temperature changes as well. So like right there, that's one of those little jerky motions where I'm making the tree like there's a knot in the tree, or the tree has, as it was growing, it changed direction right there because of a knot maybe that's in it, or because of a deer bite or something else. Maybe it got a disease at one time and it recovered from it, and then the tree grew differently in that spot. Well, all of those are fun because I can use that. If it's, let's say, a knot, I can get one area of that knot that has a nice bright highlight because it's sticking out away from the tree, and the light is coming down and really hitting strongly on that top plane of that knot. And then on the bottom side plane of the knot, it's facing away from the light dramatically, so it gets a nice strong dark contrast on the bottom of it. Or maybe that plane on the bottom of that knot is also facing a lot of those warm leaves that are on the ground, and the light's reflecting up into it, and I can put a little warm, like some red into that to give it some warmth, and I can get a color temperature contrast in it as well as a dark and light contrast. those are a lot of the things that as we move along in our paintings, we can start to experiment with that and really get some fascinating things happening in our paintings just from the play of light and dark and warm and cool color temperature shifts. And we can justify those warm and cool color temperature shifts depending on the colors that are around those objects. And they don't have to be necessarily right by it. They can just be like leaves somewhere. But if we have something in there that might suggest that it could have a light that reflects off of it and bounces maybe some warmth up into that area, that's why landscape is so fun, because we can really make up a lot of this because it actually does happen in nature. It might not necessarily be happening in, let's say we have a photo reference, it might not be happening in our photo reference, but it doesn't matter, because we know from being out observing nature all the time that that does happen, and so we can do that in our painting if we choose to. That's so much fun. That just is invigorating because it gives us possibility and opportunity to use our imagination. So here you can see I am really pushing the contrast of some of those trees, picking out one here and there. If you really look at it, you can see that there are a lot of tree trunks back in there all throughout it. And they were all basically the same value, the same overall color tone when we started. But I can pick out one here and there that I think makes the overall composition and the look of the painting more interesting and start to develop that out more. And I can do that by degrees so that they're not all developed out the same way. There's just a lot of variety in there. And if I'm constantly going down to my palette and changing just a little bit, even small little tweaks in the color or the color temperature, that then I can bring in and create even more variety within those different trunks of trees. Sometimes just a nice little dark edge on a tree can really create a three-dimensional effect that is, to me, it's just magical how that works. And that little dark outline or edge on a tree can really heighten the saturation of the colors in the rest of the tree, because they become even brighter by contrast, and then the colors are still saturated, and it really perks that up, makes it feel more dramatic. And you notice I'm not just going along finding every tree and now putting in a dark outline or a dark edge on all of them. I am finding spots. I find little areas where I feel like it might help that area. It might help that particular tree. But I don't want to do that everywhere. I don't want to suddenly go, ooh, that worked out really well. I think I'll do it here and here and here and here. Getting carried away like that is what loses the variety. Then everything's the same. We don't want everything to be the same. Go out in the woods, unless it's a really like a French garden that has been meticulously manicured. Our trees are not the same. We have them in different stages of growth, different maturity levels. They're different types of trees. There's so much that can change the way that they look. So we want to have that same idea, that same variety and unpredictable nature of it in our paintings. That will help to increase the feeling of reality. It's that realism without being overly detailed like a photograph. It's what really gives life to our paintings. It gives spirit to it. So I got that really strong, dark. I thickened it up some, that dark line, brought it in, but it was way too much. So then I can just come in with a light place it on there. I don't have to go and wipe that off. I can put another color right on it, right on top of it. But if I use a nice bristly brush, even one of my synthetic blends, like the Utrecht, what is that, 207s, they have that splayed out, some of them are splayed out bristles. I can place a color on there, especially a color that's not mixed very well, where I have lots of little bits of color mixed in there as well. It's not a really finely blended color, but it's a lot of different colors kind of mixed together. I can take that, just kind of push it into the color, pick some of that up on the edges, and have a broken up color placed on top of that. And then it allows some of that dark to come through, and we have some of that color coming through. It really makes a fun blend of colors and values. So when I talk about shapes, those trees are not the only shape right there. Like where I'm working right now in that upper corner, the trees are the things that stand out to us as an obvious shape. But the sky, those spaces of sky in between branches, those are also shapes. Those are objects. They're just not obvious objects. We don't say, oh, there's a sky hole, as much as we'll say there's a tree and there's a branch. But that becomes a shape. And all throughout my painting, I have those shapes in there. And I'm very aware of those shapes. So I want to break up those shapes so that they are interesting. I don't want just like a square right there or something like that. So when I'm thinking about these little branches that I'm putting in, I'm thinking in terms of shapes, not just of the trees themselves or the branches, but of the shapes of the sky also. So that when I break up those shapes of sky, they become something interesting, and they work with the trees, and everything's working together rather than separately. So I'm not just thinking about the trees, I'm thinking about all of the shapes that are all pieces of the puzzle and how they're integrating and working with one another. So here we are, starting to build out light and dark and little pockets of shadow and highlight to create that variety that I want in the foreground, to create that sense of realism, as if we were right there and all of this life is happening all around us. And you notice how that thicker stroke of light down in the bottom left corner, notice the way I placed that, that was intentional, because what that did is it suddenly created a stop to the trajectory of that diagonal line that we have talked about so much. That diagonal line is moving us down, and all of a sudden, boom, it gets stopped, and the viewer is no longer allowed to just progress right out of the painting. They're stopped down there by that brushstroke of light, of lighter value. And then they can be directed into other parts of the painting, because they're no longer on this free fall careening down the hill and out of our painting. They suddenly get rescued and they're stopped from moving on out, and then they get guided gently around the painting again. And you notice I can use all of these same colors in different places around the painting. I have it down in the foliage in the foreground. I can also use it up in the canopy of the leaves, up in the trees that are still alive. So all of these colors are usable all throughout my painting. Now some artists like to clean, like Matt Smith, an excellent painter. He likes to clean his palette constantly. And there is value in that, to keep our colors clean, to keep refreshing our colors so that they're not just the same all the time, pulling from the same piles. I like to keep my piles building on my palette for a long time because I can change them by degrees and I can keep a harmony going in my painting that way. And I'm not constantly redoing the same colors over and over again. And I like to build off piles because I can get areas of it that is darker in value, areas of it that's lighter in value, some that's cooler in color temperature, others that's warmer in color temperature, all within the same overall family of colors. So it really comes down to our personal preferences. There's no right or wrong to it. It's just what works for us and what doesn't. If cleaning our palette constantly helps us to keep our colors cleaner and to keep our paintings, our colors more imaginative and greater variety in there, then that's the way we should go with it. If we like to build off of our colors and really create these big piles of color with a lot of variety all through them, then do it that way. It's whatever works for us individually is the way to go. No right or wrong here. And there's nothing best about it. You take any two professional artists, the top in the industry, and they have different ways of working. There just isn't a this is the best way to do it situation. And don't ever let anyone try to convince you otherwise. Follow your own instincts, really. Learn from the best. I pick up tips, even now, I still love to pick up tips from other professional artists because we all have so many different experiences. And we, just like with this painting that we're watching right here now, this was an experiment of mine. I did not see someone else do this. The idea came to me and I thought, you know what? Maybe I'll try that. It's an intriguing idea. So I decided to go for that. Well, that happens to artists all the time. And those that are experimenting and pushing the boundaries of their own skills and ability, their own understanding. So I want to see what other artists do, what they have discovered. Then I don't have to necessarily go through all of the preliminary buildup that led to that experimentation or that discovery. I can gain it right from them right then. And it might resonate with me or it might not. Sometimes we need all of that preliminary work that goes into discovering or even coming up with the idea, the inspiration to try the particular experiment that we do. And so sometimes watching another artist do it, it just does not sink in because we haven't had all of the original build up to that moment. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it becomes a shortcut and we go, wow, that was really cool. I can use that. And I know exactly where I can use that. So that's why even now, 30 years plus of doing this full time, I still like to watch other professional artists just because I might pick up one little tip here and there as I go along. So you notice here I am really pushing some of the plain changes on those rocks and other objects that are out there in the painting. And I don't have to necessarily describe clearly what they are. It might look really closely like a rock, but then again, it might not. Some of the little dabs of color that I put in there just become dabs of color. They don't ever actually, there's not enough detail there to say definitively, this is exactly what that is. And I like that. That's the kind of variety that piques my imagination in other artists' work. And I want to have a lot of that in my own. So much of this is just going through and creating contrast, creating variety that will make the space more interesting. And sometimes they actually look like objects, those little dabs of color, like a rock or a branch or a leaf. But not always. Now, if it gets to where I feel like everything is just too busy, then I come in and simplify. I might just take a big brush and come in with some bigger brush strokes and brush over a bunch of small ones that I felt became too busy, too much activity. It was overwhelming for the viewer. Other times it might be a big area that just is kind of dull and lifeless, and I have to come in with smaller details or bring in more detail to make it more energizing. I don't know. That's how we figure it out as we go. So for the most part, it's about varying contrasts. So right there, I liked the bright that I had there on the big rock, the plane change, but not so that it's so strong. So I can just come on top of that with a small little stroke of color and completely disrupt the feeling of being too bright. And often that's what it is within the painting, is small little subtle nuanced changes that make all the difference. With that little branch there on that big tree, I'm trying to decide whether I have it attaching on the side, more as if it's coming around the front. I'm just playing with that to decide where I want the seeming attachment of that branch relative to that tree, to the tree trunk. So if it's attached more so that we can see where the attachment is, rather than maybe going around behind a little bit, then I might come in with some light and dark. So light coming down where it's rounding into the tree because it's a different plane change there. And then that, if I build that up, I can help it to feel as if it's facing the viewer more, that it's closer to us. Or I might have it go into shadow again so that it goes back behind the tree. The fun thing about all this is sometimes I'll work on a branch like that for a long time, and then I might work on it for 10 minutes or 30 minutes or an hour, building it all up, and then in one fell swoop, one brushstroke, get rid of the entire thing, just because it's not working the way that I have it in there. So can't get too attached to any one little part of the painting, no matter how much time or work we've put into it. That does not matter. It's the painting, the whole painting that matters, not one little area of it. I'm experimenting with bright branches. Either they're a light colored branch, or the plane change on that branch is catching the light in a way that it is creating a nice bright spot on it. And really it's just to help break up things, to create overlap, to push one object back into the distance more, bring another object forward based on where they are in the overlapping scheme. And a lot of, when I start putting in light and dark, a lot of it is going back and forth even within the same area. Like bringing in some highlights, then going on top of that with a shadow again, going on top of that shadow with a highlight again, just trying to work with it and change it and manipulate it in a way that it finally becomes interesting to look at. I love building up a tan color like that with maybe my transparent oxide yellow and then coming in with some manganese blue and getting just a slight green tone to it. It's such a beautiful color when you start mixing it in, especially with all of those reds and oranges and yellows that we're going to have in there. That green really works well with it. I love that, especially. I do that a lot with my aspen trees. It's a fun color to work with. Primarily because I get kind of a mix of that warm yellowish transparent oxide yellow color and the cooler blue-green. And often I'll get a mix of that. So I go back and forth, either adding more transparent oxide yellow to it to warm it up some, or more manganese blue to cool it down. And it's an easy way, there's nothing easy, but it's a great way to work with warm and cool and be able to change it quickly from warm to cool and still get a nice, pleasant color tone to some of those branches. It's nice and bright, but it's not so anemic as just adding white to it would be. And I get that nice greenish look to it that is such a nice harmony to the other fall colors. Now you notice placing it on that branch or on that trunk, it just got lost. I was hoping it would kind of stand out from the lavender colors back behind it, but it was too light. They just blended together, and there wasn't enough contrast in color temperature or anything else to really make a big difference there. But I can come back in later with something a little bit stronger, whether in contrast or saturation of color or something like that, and bring that out some. So see, breaking up, so I put in that little twig of a branch there. I can break up the edges of that by adding in little spots of light color on that dark branch, on that dark twig. So I can use some of the value to break up those edges. And then the little stroke of green, bright green right there, very light whitish green. That is to start bringing in contrast, especially near that dark rock. I want to brighten up some of that area around there. And then I have, with a lot of the greens that I've put in there so far, they're more on the cool side, like when you see back in the distance behind some of the trees on the upper right, and the little bush that I had in there, they're really more of the bluish green, cooler greens that I have in there. So now I'm bringing in some warmer greens too, kind of a transition between, yes, I have a lot of warms all through here, but it gives me that variety of warm colors, not just oranges and yellows and reds, but also some greens and other colors that are on the warmer side, kind of the way we have with some of the warmer lavender tones that are in there as well. And then it makes it, when I have the warmer greens, I can transition so nicely from the warm green to an orange or a yellow. And they just kind of work in harmony with one another. So I go in and put in a lot of little strokes of those colors. And then I can start to form out with lighter and darker to create the feeling of shadow and highlight. But I don't have to do that right away. Not everything has to have a very definite, strong shadow, and everything has to have a very definite, strong highlight on it. Some areas, some bushes are more dense than others, and they have a stronger, more apparent shadow on them. So other bushes are just maybe some strands of grass that have enough, they're strong enough in color that they stand out, but they're so sparse they don't really have necessarily a strong shadow to them. Really, I let the painting dictate what it's going to need. If the area needs more contrast, then I'll make it a more dense bush and put a stronger shadow in there, so I have more light and dark. If the area would be nice, if it would be nice just to have it kind of broken up with less contrast in there, then I create more sparse bushes and plants, clumps of grass or whatever else I want to put in there, and leave the shadows out. On an overcast day like this, it's easy to do that, and no one will question it. So you notice how I went back to that tree, the base of that tree where I put that dark stroke, and I started to touch it here and there. That's just because I want to, usually those little touches that I'm doing are to break up like a dark shape or maybe an edge on that. Pull an edge out a little bit with a really quick flick of the brush. I can grab the edge of something of a dark shape like that, or dark stroke that I might have just put down. I can grab the very edge, one edge of it, not all the edges, but maybe one edge somewhere, and just kind of flick it quickly, and it creates a breakup of that. It pulls some of that color out into the background around it. And that helps to then tie those areas together, and it helps to break up the edges on that little shape, that little stroke of color. I can do the same thing with lights all through my painting. I can use those to break up edges of shapes and edges of objects. So now I start thinking more about the clumps of leaves and how to really pull all of that red through it without the red becoming overpowering, but having kind of a pattern of red going through it, but a nice movement, not just like a strong, definite line of red going all the way across, because there's going to be some trees that have red on them that are taller or shorter than another. So I don't want just a continuous line of red necessarily across there, but I do want to help use that red to guide the viewer through the painting. So I do want to create some movement with it, some very definite directional force with that color, but not necessarily so that it feels like all of the trees for some reason have red leaves all in the same area, all in the same height. Wow, how did that even happen? You know, I want to avoid that if I can. So with something like what I'm doing right there with that rock, it's just bringing a little bit more definite form to the rock. Adding a little bit stronger contrast there, so I can come in a darker color, so I can come in with maybe a bright, crisp highlight on the edge of that, dark edge of that rock. See, and I play back and forth. Sometimes I bring in that hard edge and it doesn't work. It feels too hard. But a hard edge like that can come about where a rock, maybe a chip of it gets broken off, a whole piece of it. Sometimes the rocks just start to fracture because of the winter. The water gets into crevices and it swells and it splits a rock in different places. And where you have that really sharp break between the two pieces of rock, maybe one of those pieces of rock has fallen off. The rains have come, they've tumbled one piece of it away from the other, but we're still left with a sharp edge on the top of that rock. Well, that's where the light can hit that plane and it can create that really bright highlight right there. We don't necessarily, maybe the plane is facing away from us and we see just the edge of it, and we get that highlight where the light is hitting on the other side of it. So the side facing the viewer is darker, the side facing away from the viewer is lighter, and we just get that bright highlighted edge. Sometimes that works really well, and I love that when it does. Sometimes it just feels too strong, and that sharp line demands attention, and that's when I have to soften it out so that it doesn't pull forward too much. See there, I'm just using a few bristles from that brush to try to grab the edge of that dark trunk and just barely pull some of that color off into the background to break up that edge and to integrate those two objects, the background and the tree itself. They're both objects. One is ground and one is a tree. Okay, so what I'm struggling with right there is that those two branches where they were forking off, the fork in those branches was right at the edge of that tree behind them. So I don't want that. That's a tangent that is uncomfortable. So I wanted to break that up and get rid of that tangent that was there. So right there, I'm adding that in because I felt like there was a really long space of light, the same kind of, almost the same value and treatment through that whole long space there of that tree trunk. So I wanted to break that up some with light and dark. I felt like I was getting that a little bit too thick, too wide for that tree trunk. So just coming back in with some of the background color and cutting into it again. So I can come in with some really light color, and even if it's not a perfect match for what's behind it, I'm mainly trying to shape the tree first, then I can come back in and reshape the color of that light that I just put in there. Just like that, adding in those reds, coming back in with some little branches that feel like they're off in the distance. See, it's just recreating the background again. But first I was concerned, rather than working around all those little things, all the little things that are off in the distance, I wanted to get the shape of the tree correct first, and then I can come back in and work on shaping the background. Now that doesn't work the way it is because it feels like I just cut into the tree, like someone took an axe and made a hack at it. They're going to cut it all down. I don't want that kind of a sudden chop into the tree. I want my tree to feel alive. A lot of this, I'm using a flat brush here, and much of that is just going very lightly with plenty of paint on the very edge of my brush, going very lightly to create some of those real thin branches in there. And I've got to be very careful right here because this tree, this little sliver of a tree, is kind of right in the middle of the painting. So sometimes I get going along and having so much fun creating those little slivers of line I don't actually realize where I've created those slivers of line. They were just so much fun to do in the first place. So then I have to stop and think about what I've just done, and if it's decide whether it's working or not. Some of those little tiny bits of color that I just put in there, those bright little spots of color, that's just, those could be individual leaves that are down there that are wet, a little bit damp, and they're reflecting the light. And so we've got those, they're almost like little tiny spotlights, or like sprites that are there in the woods, creating light and making the image more fanciful, I guess. So some of that leaf work that I put in, some of it's thinner. I don't necessarily need a lot of texture with it. Other areas I'll suddenly just put more pressure so that a lot more paint comes off my brush, and much more brush texture is left behind as well. So even within what I'm doing now, I'm thinking of variety. Not just in the color, because often it's the same color that's on the brush as I'm working, but variety as in thin and thick as well with the paint texture. So now I can start to make it feel as if that little tree is coming more forward, and it pushes that other tree back behind a little bit, and that even that little amount of work can help then to break up that line there in the front, that diagonal line that we talk so much about. Now it's not just one strong line all the way down. There's movement in there. It changes from one spot to another in the strength of the line. So that line gets broken up a lot now with all the little fluctuations and changes that we've put in there. There we go. Now I can utilize that little tree that we just put in to even push that main tree back a little bit. That way that tree trunk is not as harsh as it might otherwise be. It's so strong, it's so dark in contrast to everything else in the painting that I need to break that up somehow. And these leaves are a perfect way to do that. And then I can take the same color, pull some of that down into the foreground. And we don't have to be afraid when we put in a stroke and it's really bright and it seems almost obnoxious, because we can easily come on top of that with a little dab of some other color, a darker contrast, a different color temperature, and manipulate it, change it some, while still maintaining most of it there. So oil paint is wonderful because we can keep working back and forth, and we don't have to worry about, it's not like watercolor where there's only so much you can do to work with it. we can come back on top with as many layers as we want to. And it will not usually affect the integrity of the painting. Now, in the case of Jackson Pollock, where he used commercial grade paints meant for the walls in a home, that's a different story. Those paints weren't meant to last a lifetime. They were just meant to last 25, 30, 40 years or less. So their adhesion just didn't last. It didn't hold up. But if we are working mostly with straight oil paints, for the most part, they are going to chemically bond, so we don't have to worry about how many layers we get on here. They're all going to hold on to each other. And here's where a lot of fun starts to come in, where I can play with little specks of leaves and really create small little specks of dark, small little specks of bright highlight, and really start to get a sparkle going all throughout the painting. I love that part of it. That's so much fun for me. That's why some people really like to simplify and not do much with small details. Well, I have fun with the small details. So it's all in our several personalities. We just work with what we've got. But don't worry about detail as long as the detail feels natural. If it starts to feel overly busy, or to us, if it starts to feel busy to us, if it just doesn't feel alive or natural, then we need to analyze it and think about why it's not working. Otherwise, we can have fun with as much detail as we want. So adding in those greens, that really livens up those reds. The reds become more red because of the green that's next to it. It's the same thing when we have, let's say we have a light value in our painting and it doesn't feel light enough. Well, maybe if it's as light as we can go, let's say we just use pure white and it still doesn't feel light enough. We can come right around it or beside it and put a dark next to it. And that will, by contrast, make that light feel even lighter. Well, with color, if we have a red in there, it just doesn't feel red enough. Well, if we come in with a complementary color like green and put that around it or next to it, it will, by contrast of the color harmony, make that red even more red. It'll make it feel more red than it was before. A lot of what I'm doing right now with those strokes of color, is I'm just putting in color. I know a lot of that's going to get covered over. It's not going to stay there the way it is, but remnants of that, no matter what I do, usually, remnants of it will shine through. So especially with something like that red that I put in there, that's really fun because when I start putting layers on top of that, little bits of that red will still glow up through there, and it'll just enliven it, make it more fun. Sometimes I come back in at the end of a painting and put little dabs of red in there to do the same, basically to have the same effect, to enliven the painting. There's something about red that really is engaging, makes the painting more alive. So if I want to get shadows that feel like they're off in the distance, then I get a darker lavender. Still using lavender, and it's not dark lavender, it's a darker lavender than what I might have around it. And that helps then to create shadows or objects that feel darker, maybe a bush that's so far away from us that the mist, the atmosphere, has obscured it. So we see that it's a dark shape, but we don't know what exactly that shape is. That's what that darker lavender's for. Grasses are another thing that I really have fun with. I love that we can come in with a little thin or thick stroke of a blade of grass and transform something like a rock. We put a little bit of grass in front of a rock and suddenly that rock feels like it's stuck to the ground. And that is just really a lot of fun. As much as I love color, if everything is just bright, bright, saturated color, then nothing is really going to feel true. The colors become then all the same emphasis. And if everything has the same importance to it, then nothing really is important. So in my paintings, I do love to have a lot of really nice, juicy color, but I have to have plenty of modifiers around it. So we talked earlier about if we want a red to feel more red, maybe put some green around it, or some other colors that will heighten the sense of red that's there. If we want a painting to feel really colorful, but in a natural way, with a sense of realism to it, rather than just in a decorative, oh, there's color splashed everywhere kind of way, then the colors that we really want to say something about. So in this case, I want the leaves, all of the final leaves and foliage in the trees, to be very bright and vibrant and colorful with reds and yellows and oranges. So in order to do that, I need to have something around it that isn't nearly as saturated in color. So some of the things that I have to think about in terms of wanting to focus on color is that colors are, if we want to have really saturated color, the color is going to be a darker value overall. So as bright as I want my leaves to feel, they're not going to feel colorful if everything is full of white. White is the absence of color. There's no color there. Everything's been reflected away and we see nothing. We see no color. So I can't just come in and get everything bright by adding a lot of white to it. That is just going to deaden all of my colors. So in order to have nice saturated color, they have to be darker. All right, so this gets a little bit complicated to dissect in a way that is understandable. And so I have to kind of work through my thought process here just a bit. All right, so we have a few concepts at play here. We've got the idea that if we want something to feel darker, then we put something lighter around it. If we want something to feel lighter, we put something darker around it. If we want a color to feel more saturated with that particular hue, such as red, then we have a couple of options. One, we can use the paint straight out of the tube. That's as saturated generally as it's going to get, unless we're talking about the darker colors like ultramarine blue. Ultramarine blue is going to look much more saturated and blue if we put a little white into it, because when it's too dark, we also aren't seeing the color there. And ultramarine blue comes out of the tube very dark, so we don't see just how blue it is or what type of blue it is, how yellow or red that blue is. In the case of something like a red, then what I like to do a lot with the reds to get them to really come forward is to, first of all, start with a darker red, like maybe cadmium red medium with some alizarin crimson or the quinacridone red mixed into it. And then on top of that, I put a bright speck of cad red light. And by contrast then, here we are again with the contrast. The the cadmium red light then looks very saturated as a red hue, and it looks very bright because the dark around it that we've placed it on top of heightens the lightness of it. Those are some of the techniques that I use, some of the ideas that flow through my mind as I'm painting that help me to achieve the brightness or the saturation of color that I want. Same thing with yellows. So with all the little 10% highlights that I'm going to put in at the end, all the little final flourishes that really bring a painting to life, that give it some kind of pizzazz or energy, much of those I have to wait until the end because I have to think in terms of what we just described. So a bright yellow leaf. If I have bright yellow leaves everywhere, then none of them are going to feel especially bright. But if I have mostly the middle hue or the middle value hues, like a yellow that's has a little bit of red in it, or maybe the cad red medium compared to the cad lemon. If I have, let's say, the cad red medium as a yellow all around, and then I come in with a cad lemon with maybe just a touch of white in it, that cad yellow or that cad lemon with a little white in it is suddenly just going to burst with light. It's going to feel so much brighter than it would otherwise. That's how I get the feeling of lots of light and the sparkles and things that are in the painting without brightening everything up and getting carried away with it. So all the way through my painting, even when I'm doing like the little twigs here, the little bits of grass, all the little sparks of color and dark and light contrast, with all of those, that's what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking in terms of, okay, what do I want to have here? Do I want to have a kind of a brightly lit rock? Well, if I want to have a brightly lit rock, are the colors that I'm going to place it on to, are they dark enough to make that feel brightly lit? Because if I just go and I want a brightly lit rock, and I place it in amongst other fairly brightly lit areas, it's not going to feel necessarily as bright as I want it to. So with each of the things that I'm putting in now, with little twigs and branches and little sparks of color, if I want to turn them into grasses or bushes, I'm thinking in terms of light and shadow, and I'm also thinking about my painting overall as where does it need some kind of a punch, either a dark punch or a light punch, where it will help to enliven that area, and also to make it feel more natural. Now, something else to consider as I go through here is if I really want the leaves up in the trees to be the focus of the painting, but I still want to have plenty of interest in the rest of the painting, I have to make sure that in my desire to have interest in the rest of the painting, especially in the foreground area, that I don't allow that to compete with the colors that I will have in the foliage up above. So in this case, much of what is in the foreground are fallen leaves, things that have come off the same trees and the same leaves that I'll be painting that are alive. So sure, when things fall off the trees, they can tend to become more brown and they start to dry out. They're not as saturated. But let's say we just had a storm and all of these leaves just fell off the trees, and so they're bright and vibrant. Even in that case, I don't want to paint them that bright and vibrant, because then they're going to compete with the leaves up in the trees. And that's my focal area. That's the area that I want to have the greatest saturation of color, the greatest vibrancy. So down below, I need to make sure that I have plenty of grayed down, toned down colors that are still energetic. They still have value to them. They still have value as in interest for the viewer, but they're not as saturated and as intense as what I have maybe up in the trees. Those are some of the things that I have to think about as I'm painting to make sure that I don't get carried away with all of the fun stuff that's down here in the foreground. I could have a lot of fun with that and really punch all of that up and make it vibrant and energetic and full of the same kind of saturation that I have everywhere else in the painting. But I want to try to avoid that if I can. Unless, of course, I want to make the emphasis be the foreground rather than the leaves up in the trees. And then I would de-emphasize the colors and saturation in the trees up above, and I would focus more on the foreground. Now, some of that might be modified slightly depending on how I want to guide the viewer through the painting. So if I have a particular path that I'm thinking about for those who come into the painting, then I'm going to use saturated color or higher contrast of light and dark to help lead the viewer through, possibly. Those I also have to think about. So in terms of the rock that I'm just now working on, you notice I put in that bright light on there. Well, if I had left just that large stroke of light color on that rock, it really had a tendency to pull the viewer right down to that rock. It was so bright. And I knew that even when I got to the finishing stages, that was still going to feel relatively bright compared to what I had in other places in the painting. So that needed to be toned down, and so it wasn't as bright as I originally created it. But you notice that I didn't get rid of all that brightness. I came over with a little bit darker stroke, not a dark stroke, but a little bit. It's still a light value, so it's still a highlight, just slightly darker than what the original color was. And I left just a little edge of bright still in there. So we don't have to get rid of everything necessarily. No throwing out the baby with the bathwater, right? So here I'm playing with some sparkles of color. And so when I said we don't want to compete with the leaves up above, that doesn't mean I can't have little spots of really brilliant, pure color down in my foreground. Some of that is what's going to give it energy. It's just not going to be as much as what I have up in the leaves up above. So something like that, that little bright brush stroke suddenly becomes a rock, another small rock that's brighter, the light's catching it, and it's on the dark side of that bigger rock, so that I'm breaking up spaces again. I'm breaking up the shape of that big rock, so it's not quite so dark and overpowering right there. And it starts to integrate it into other parts of the foreground so that it feels like it belongs with everything around it. Keeping that idea in our minds of relativity is so critical. This isn't an Einstein thing here. This is just everything. One thing is relative to another. Color is relative. The colors that we use, they're relative to what's around them. The values are relative. So the foreground, you'll notice the overall relative value of the foreground is going to be darker than the overall relative value of the leaves up above and the atmosphere, the air that's up in flowing in between the trees and the leaves. And that helps the ground then to feel like ground, and the area up above to feel much more like air, and the light filtering through that air. So when we talk about shadows in the upper portion of it, which is the biggest portion of the painting, then those shadows can still feel like shadows even when they are light. So some of the shadows in that upper area might be just as light as some of the highlights on rocks or other objects down in the lower area, the foreground area. And yet in the upper area, they feel like shadows, and in the lower area, they feel like highlights. That's relativity. It's really based upon what is around it. So some of what I'm putting in right now, these little strokes of light bluish color, That's so that I can get some cools mixed in with the warms. And those cools will help so that the warms aren't overpowering. Otherwise, it's too orange. That bottom areas will be so orange that it just is, the strength of it will overpower the viewer. And I don't want to overpower them. I want to stimulate their minds and their imagination, but not overpower and tire them out because of the strength of the color down there. So usually a color feels much more brilliant and saturated when the colors around it aren't as brilliant and saturated. So I put a bunch of grayed down versions of colors around a saturated color, and then it suddenly makes all the grayed down versions of those colors feel much more lively and saturated, even when they aren't. But it doesn't take much. But if I do the opposite and I have mostly everything saturated and brilliant and just maybe a little grayed down color here and there, then nothing's going to really feel that saturated and brilliant because it's relative. Everything is already saturated and brilliant. And by the relativity of it, then nothing is. Yep, I do a lot of little dots, dabbing at it, it seems like. And the reason for that is I want just a touch of little colors on particular edges. I'm looking for a spot, either a shape of color that is too dominant as a shape. It feels, so if a shape starts to feel too flat, like it's a solid color right there, then it starts to come forward. It becomes too strong of a shape. So I'll look for an edge or maybe a spot somewhere within that shape that I can put a little dab of color and to break it up a little bit. And it might not be hardly any kind of a change at all to it as far as the color or the value or the color temperature, but it's enough, even if it's subtle, to make a change that breaks that from being a flat, solid object that's coming out and jutting out towards the viewer to something that settles down and fits into its space within the overall scene, the overall landscape. And then it starts to feel natural. So I was thinking about that, a long line of dark purple right there, and it felt just too strong by itself, like that. Too much dark right in that spot. And then it kind of created a little trail of dark that led the viewer down too much and connected too much with that tree. So I'm trying to break that up a little bit and help that so that the tree feels like it's grounded, but it is not this line like a big worm or something slithering its way through the painting. And I can do that by breaking it up into becoming rocks or something else. Little bits of grass. So when working with these trees that are in the background, I have to pay particular attention to the color temperature of what I put back there. So if I just took, let's say, some transparent oxide red and use that to make a highlight or to make a shadow on one of those trees back there, it's so warm, such a saturated, warm color that with all the coolness around it, it's really going to come forward. It's not going to feel like it fits into that area back there. So I have to pay close attention to the type of color temperature, especially of the color temperature of the color that I'm putting back there, to make sure that it really recedes and feels like it belongs in its space. And transparent oxide red is just too warm of a color temperature to even mix into my background colors and still have them fade back in the distance and feel like they are part of all of that, all of those blues and lavenders that are back behind. Whereas an ultramarine blue and an alizarin crimson, which are both as dark as the transparent oxide red, they will work. I can use those and work with those, adding white to them, and they'll feel natural back there because they're a much cooler color temperature than the transparent oxide red. Notice how just a little line of highlight can suddenly start giving tremendous form to an object. Although to me that one was too distractive, so that's why I got rid of it. And I'm not really a fan of how dark that was right there near the edge. So I needed to push that back into the ground a little bit more. That really dark contrast was too much. That made it really pop forward toward the viewer. I watch for those things. Even if it's a little stroke or a bigger shape in there, they can equally pop forward if they seem out of harmony with the other contrasts and values around them. So a lot of this is really using a mix of warm and cool colors within each area. So like there, I just put in a little stroke of that bluish colored on the edge of it. So I get that mix. Because my light source is a little bit of a cooler light source since it's overcast, so coming in with a highlight that's got some of that blue in it, I can use that, and it really helps to give a nice variety to that rock with the warmer overall tone and then that little nice cool highlight that I put on there. And I don't think about that everywhere in the painting. I don't go and think, oh, this highlight needs to be cool because it's a cool light source. I really am thinking in terms of relativity. So each thing, I mix up the color, I put it on there. If it feels right, then I leave it. But there is some thought that goes into some of that. But once in a while, I have to experiment because I might think, well, I think a cool highlight right here would work out just brilliantly. I put it on there and it doesn't work out brilliantly. It feels completely unnatural. And I then have to experiment to find out why and play with the color a little bit until I get it right. You know, one way of, so right now I'm just taking and cutting back into that tree a little bit just to, so it's not so wide at the top. I want it to start to thin out as it goes higher up. But it made me think about how to soften an edge on something like a tree trunk that is so stark and strong against a bright sky, a dark tree trunk against a bright sky. So one way to soften an edge is to come in with a brush and break up that edge. Just like with a brush that has a little bit of splayed bristles or a nice hog bristle brush, and just take a few bristles and grab the edge of that, let's say the tree trunk, an edge of that, of the paint, and pull it out into the background. So it breaks up that edge. We can do it that way, or we can pull, of course, the bright of the sky into that same edge to help break it up. Well, we can also come in with a value that's just slightly darker or a bit darker than, let's say, the sky. We take a value, it's the same color as the sky basically, but it's a darker value, and then we place that right next to the tree trunk, the color of the tree trunk. That will also help to soften that edge because it becomes a transition between the dark contrast of the tree trunk against the bright contrast of the sky. it becomes a transitional tone or value between those two. And that is another way to soften an edge on an object. And actually, it often is a better way to do it because it allows the two areas, the sky and the tree trunk, to remain strong. The edges are strong, the contrast, the colors, the values, they remain very saturated and in their full strength, their full power, the way that we originally painted them. And so instead of changing them by adding a light color as a highlight on the tree trunk, or pulling an edge out and disrupting that edge, we can actually leave everything as is and just place a darker color right next to an edge, and that becomes a transitional value that softens that edge. Really, the things that we do when we're pulling out the paint on an edge of something, or putting on a highlight or a little darker edge on the back side of a shadow, we're really just creating transitions between contrasting values or contrasting colors as well. So there is no one way of doing any of these things. There are many ways to go about achieving the same overall idea. Some ways are stronger than others, and we can discover a lot of that just by experimentation, working at it ourselves. It's all about playing. It's all about getting in there and not being afraid to experiment and see what works and what doesn't. The same as what I did originally with this painting itself. The whole painting was an experiment, something that I had not done before, and I hadn't actually seen anyone else do it. It was just an idea that came to me. So I thought I would explore that a bit and see what the results were. And I was very happy with the results from it. And so was the the gallery, because it sold within a week, and I had more than one person that wanted the same painting. So if I decide to revisit that one, I already have a receptive audience for it. That's not the reason I want to explore it, though. I actually felt the same way about it before I sent it to the gallery as I did after I found out it sold quickly and resonated with others. I think whatever it was that attracted me to it is the same thing that attracted others to it. Something about playing with all of that paint texture and still maintaining the nice saturated colors throughout the painting. There's something very magical about that. And I'm looking forward to doing a series of paintings with that and exploring it even more and really getting the idea of it, the techniques and concepts involved in it, solidified in my thinking. And those are some of the things that I've done throughout my career. In the 90s, I was painting very thick and fast. I could do a 30 by 40 painting in half a day, 6 hours maybe, sometimes less. And even painting on location. That's how I painted a 24 by 30 inch out at Glacier National Park in a drizzling rain and completed it in about 4 hours. And I was done. It was ready for a gallery. So after a while, I decided I just felt like I needed to have a little bit more subtlety involved in my work, and I started to experiment with subtlety. And then I went through a period where my paintings got stiff and felt kind of lifeless because I was a bit timid with some of the new approaches I was taking to my painting. But eventually the two have kind of combined so that I have the thick and spontaneous that I had in my early work mixed with a lot of the subtlety that I was going for in my later work. So we can't be afraid to experiment. And all along the way, I've done the same thing with just even little amounts of experimentation and change in my work. Constantly trying to adjust and strengthen it, make it better. always more engaging and satisfying that creative curiosity that we have. What if